be put out on our websites, both the league and the libraries, in a couple of weeks, so it's accessible to many more people than we have this evening, but.
Yes. Well, if I may start my regular spiel, we are now recording, and I have the transcript going for those that want it. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm a librarian at Detroit Public Library. We have been presenting this program since September 2020. We present on issues of concern to Michigan voters about 10 months of the year. You were brought into this program muted. Please put any questions into the chat. Ruth Colwyn will capture those questions and ask them at the end of the presentation. We might be able to allow people to unmute at the end to ask questions directly if time allows. This presentation is being recorded, and it will be made available on DPL's and the Detroit League's websites. To better reach people who would be interested in future programs, we are putting together an email list. If you would like to receive advance notice of programs, please email me at jdye@detroitpubliclibrary.org. And you are also welcome to suggest topics and speakers for future programs. I'm sorry, Cheryl, would you be willing to give your presentation about the league again?
Oh, that's all right. I did a brief thing and I'd forgotten what you said, so I added it. I'm afraid you're.
Yes, this is the point where we usually do the information about the league. And I didn't get this done. Jeff, would you please tell me how to pronounce your last name? Grynaviski? Grynaviski. We are very pleased to have Jeff Grynaviski here tonight to talk to us about the allocation of seats in the Congress and exactly why Michigan keeps losing seats in the House of Representatives, even though we gain slightly with every census. And I will bow out now. Jeff, if you would take over.
I would be happy to. Thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I have two connections to the League of Women Voters. I was telling some of the women who were in the pre-meeting that I have an aunt and her husband have been active in the League of Women Voters in Cleveland. And the second is I had a Doom school board campaign hosted where the local debate was hosted by the League of Women Voters. And I thought that was a wonderful public service for the group to provide. And I'm also really glad I lost that election. With that, and I also wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to try to share my slideshow. Does that look? Cheryl, can you give me a thumbs up because your camera's on? Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so I want to talk about the census and allocation of congressional seats. I want to talk about how and when the number of seats in the U.S. House was first set, or how it's set in general, why this number has not changed in almost 100 years, possible impacts these numbers have on governance and the relationships to their on the governance and the relationship of representatives to their constituents. And I want to in particular focus my remarks today on what the founding fathers thought about this. And today we have congressional districts that have about 750,000 people. Back then they were like, is 30,000 too small or too big? And what that means. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about Michigan's representation, but I think it might be more interesting to get comments from the group than just my opinion, except for the fact, like, I can speak a little bit to why Michigan's representation seems like it's getting smaller and smaller. Okay. So the short version of my talk is and I'm going, this is kind of like the helicopter view, and then I'll give a deeper dive in a minute. The Constitution of 1787 set the original size of the House of Representatives at 65 members. Okay. And with this, the census changed the size of the population or every 10 years, it was a new census. Population in the United States grew, and and the federal government was forced every 10 years to, or was, in theory, by the Constitution, it was supposed to update its census or its number of House seats reflecting the census. But that process has been imperfect. Okay. But for now, I want you to bear in mind that the early rule of thumb is that states only or tended to only gain seats. They almost never lost seats. And today, like, I think part of the premise of the conversation is, why does Michigan keep losing seats? For a long time, states just gain seats, or is about a wash. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was true. It was in the 1910 census that the House membership reached 435 members, which is the current number of members we have today. So for 115 years, if I'm doing the math right off top of my head, the House hasn't grown in more than 100 years. Okay. And the reason that was given at the time was that the Capitol building had become too full. So Congress just stopped adding members. So if you're looking for a deep philosophical reason for why we only have 435 members of the House of Representatives, there ain't one. Congress didn't want to redecorate or build a new building or whatever would have been involved to do it. And the problem of the House getting big, too large of a membership, was so big that Congress actually failed to reapportion after the 1920 census, which would seem to be its constitutional duty. And I'll go over the Constitution in a little bit. Okay, and so today's rule of thumb is that because there's a fixed chamber size, 435 members, changes in population apply. Some seats or some states gain seats and others lose them. Okay. And so just like real quickly, this is what the size or the number of seats in the US House of Representatives looked like from 1792 to the present. I started in 1792 because that was the first apportionment after the first census. So we actually knew how many Americans lived in each of the different states. Okay. And so what you see-ish is the size of the House of Representatives basically grew every 10 years with growing numbers of people who lived in the United States until 1911, 1912. And it's been 435 members since then, just a flat line. Okay. And this has had important consequences for how many people are represented by each representative, or I refer to it as each seat. Okay. And so the early Congresses, it was about 30 or 40,000 people who were represented by each member of the House of Representatives. Today, it's about 750,000. And we'll go into many of the implications of that in a little bit, but it's just like I think there are changes in technology, like the ease of travel, the ease of communicating by radio or Facebook or whatever that can tell a story by which or in which having so many people being represented by one member of the House of Representatives is less of a big deal, but the founding fathers thought it was a big deal to have more than 30 or 40 or 50,000 people being represented by one member of Congress. Okay. Okay, so that's the short version. Like the short version is Congress basically grew with population until Congress got too big and they stopped growing. The longer version, I want to talk about the founding debate. I think this is actually really interesting. The reapportionment of 1840. I'm going to talk about the 1920 reapportionment or the lack thereof after the census. That's really interesting because it seems like Congress just failed to do its constitutional duty. And then since that time, some of the larger questions about the size of the House and what it means for you and me living in the United States today. Okay. So if you go back to the controversies during the American founders, if you read the convention debates and the ratification debates between like the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, there are two main issues that I took from it. One is the debate was mostly over the practicality of a continental republic. Can you actually have a government for everyone who lives in the United States, even at this time of the 13 original colonies, nevertheless, how big the United States is today? Okay. The second thing, and it comes up over and over again, is that the founding fathers were aware of the relevance of their decisions for future generations. Okay, and so in terms of the topic of today's for today's talk, they were aware of the fact that the country might grow really big, and they didn't want to just set a fixed. They were reluctant to set a fixed rule saying for every X number of people who live in the United States, you get a representative, because they were kind of aware of the fact that Congress might get really big. Okay, and that brings me to the second of the bullet points is like, what would a larger House of Representatives, a larger chamber, what would that tend to do? Okay, probably the most important thing is make it harder to access office for ordinary men without celebrity or wealth. There was not yet a Napoleon, but they are aware of the idea that there might be a military hero who would be the obvious person to in a community to get elected. Is the qualities of a military hero or the richest or most famous person the obvious candidate to represent you in government rather than an ordinary person like you or me? Okay, so there's that underlying idea of this, and to me, one of the things that I find interesting about this period is if you go back to study the ancient Greeks and parts of ancient Greeks or ancient Greece where they had anything like democracy, most of their elections were held by lot. It wasn't actually a democratic election. You just randomly chose people basically out of a vase. And okay, you are now the treasurer or the senator from our community, because they realize how unfair it was to give such an advantage to people of celebrity or wealth. Like, how do you get elected? Is it because you're on a movie star or a football star or whatever, or a person who actually represents the interests of people like me? Like, and so there's like this like long-standing idea going back thousands of years, 1,500 years. Second, A larger chamber would tend to increase the number of minority groups' interest that might be represented. Because if you have a large number of people in the House of Representatives, they might be able to represent a small local community. If you have a large number of members in the House of Representatives, sorry, the larger the number of people in the House, the smaller the groups they can represent locally. Okay. Third, there the sizes of quorums in a larger house. I'm not sure how often people who are attending have been a member of a committee or whatever, but sometimes the number of people who have to be present in order to be able to be able to be allowed to vote is a big deal. And one of the factors in pushing up in debates about how large the House of Representatives ought to be is also like, do we want a small number of people to call a vote and just be like, surprise, this is the law? Okay. And the last thing, I think this looms large today, is how much larger do you want the House of Representatives to be today, just in terms of their being able to make decisions, have debates, and things like that. And I actually, like when I logged on today, I don't know if we have a budget for next year, or actually for this year, after Friday, whatever it is. And like the bigger the House is, the bigger these decision-making bodies are, the less efficient it's going to be probably to reach decisions and hopefully consensus. Okay, third point during the controversy over the size of the House in the American founding is a debate over what are we apportioning by population. And today, when we think about the House of Representatives, we think only about the House being apportioned, or the only consequential apportionment decision is about the number of seats in Congress or the number of votes you get in the Electoral College. But they also had in mind that the amount a state should pay in taxes should be apportioned based on the number of votes they get in Congress. And so probably many of you remember from like your high school civics classes the phrase "no taxation without representation." This is my quote, but there's may also have been no representation without taxation. Okay, and if you kind of think back to like those early childhood lessons when you learned about like the expansion of suffrage, it was often like who got to vote at the founding. It was just the propertied white men. And then it kind of a gradual expansion of suffrage to more people than that. It was the propertied white men who had paid the property taxes or whatever in their calculations. Okay, and that raises this next bullet point. How many seats or votes, however you want to translate that logic to, do you want if you have to pay taxes in proportion to the number of votes? And so if each state was taxed based on the number of members of the House of Representatives, do you want to have more representation or less? Because the more representation you had, the more you paid, which I find fascinating. Okay, and that's actually literally in the Constitution. I'll be there in a second. Okay. Okay. And a third point on this last little thing is, and if seats and taxes are portioned using different formulas, how would one want a slave to count? And so if you're thinking about how much representation you want in Congress, if you were from the slaveholding South, you would want a slave to count as the same as everybody else. If you were from the North, you would not want a slave to count at all, because it's shifting representation in Congress from the North to the South or vice versa. When you're talking about taxes, how do you want a slave to count? If you're from the South, you would say, I don't want a slave to count at all, because if we count them, it's going to increase my taxes. If you're from the North, you would say, they're doing hard work, you should pay more for the product of their labor. And so like there's this underlying tension about like what to deal with the slavery question, where one region of the country is saying, how should we count a slave on issues of congressional seats? It would say, I want to count a slave to be a whole person. On the issue of taxes, a zero person, and then you would flip it for the other, vice versa. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so what does the text of the Constitution actually say about taxation? Okay, first line of Article 1, Section 2 that discusses this, the apportionment of seats and taxes was explicitly linked. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. So in 1789, whenever that first Congress sat, 1789, like the more representation you had in the House of Representatives, the more taxes they expected you to pay. Okay. Second, there's the 3/5 clause, which says, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Okay, the 3/5 clause wasn't just about representation in the House of Representatives, it was also thought to be about taxes. Okay, and put a pin in that for a minute. I'll address like that, what happened to the taxes part. Okay, after the first meeting of Congress, there shall be every 10 years a census, which Congress shall direct. The Constitution fixed the maximum and minimum number of seats per state. Every state gets at least one representatives, and you're guaranteed at least, or shall not exceed one for every 30,000 people who live there. And then because they had not yet conducted a census, the Constitution just gave a list of like, this is how many seats every state gets based on our best guesses. Couple interesting developments before World War I. Should Congress continue to grow with the US population, one of the original 12 proposed amendments to the Constitution, the 10 surviving of which are the Bill of Rights, one of which was to peg the growth of the US population more or less directly to the size of, was to peg the size of the House of Representatives to growth in the US population. Probably you've never heard of that constitutional amendment because it doesn't exist, because it was never ratified. Second is the US never actually apportioned taxes by population. And so there is this original linkage in the drafting of the Constitution that says the more seats you get in Congress, the more you will be taxed. We never actually taxed that way. And so now when we think about apportionment and representation, we think only about that first piece, that how many seats do we get, because that's how many votes we get. We don't think in terms of the more seats we get, the more we have to pay. Some of the issues that arose, I'm not going to go into any long conversation about this, is there's the word problem that arises from representation based on population, because like situations arose over the course of US history where like they tried formulas to try to figure out how to apportion seats. And sometimes Congress could lose seats based on the formula, even as the population grew. Or a state could gain people, and maybe Michigan would be a good example of this. Michigan keeps getting a little bit bigger, I think, or at least more people per district. But you gain people, but lose seats. Okay. The second, I'm not going to dwell on this, is there's the fractional remainder problem. And it's basically if you divide the US population by some number of seats, states will have a remainder, like you remember from long division way back when for most of us. Do you round the remainder up or down? Okay. And the third thing that I find interesting about the period before World War I is the Constitution doesn't say we have to have single member districts the way we have here in Michigan, where we basically divide up the state into, is it 13 districts now? And it's like you just divide up a map. Like many states actually held statewide elections and they gave allocated seats based on something more like proportional representation. The Constitution's silent on this. Um, and uh, and it wasn't until I'll skip to this last bullet point on the slide. It wasn't until 1872 that when Congress did its apportionment decisions, that it actually required congressional districts to have the same number of people living in each, at least within a state. Okay. Okay. The period after World War I find to be the most interesting about the census and House apportionment. And it's because Congress refused or failed to reapportion following the census, despite the apparent constitutional mandate that it had to. Okay. And I think the easy explanation for this is demographic change, because during World War I, there was a massive movement of people from rural areas to urban areas to fuel the war effort. Okay, so there's rapid growth of cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and California. And this was a process that had already been going on. I think the war just added accelerant to it. Okay. And for most of American history, Congress, like when we skip back to my slides, Congress kept getting bigger with the population. And then you get to about 1910, 1920, it stopped getting bigger. And the explanation that's given in the histories of Congress is that Congress, like, we're just full. We can't possibly fit another member in the chamber. Okay. Probably as the political scientist, I don't find the housekeeping aspect of the argument to be very interesting. I think probably what happened is that reapportionment would have moved seats away from rural parts of the South and Midwest to big cities. Okay. And part of that movement is it was largely fueled by African Americans from the South moving to the North and immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe that would have dramatically changed the makeup of the electorate in the big cities, the number of seats they would have gotten being elected from there, and so on. Okay. And at the time, it was debated, if this is just a consequence of the war effort, maybe people will move back to where they were before. So let's just put a pin in this for a couple of years and see what happens. Okay. The other development after World War I that is significant is like serious questions began to arise about what if states didn't choose to redistrict at all. And from the perspective of the early 20th century courts, the early 1900s, this was considered what legal scholars would call a political question that was largely beyond the reach of the courts. And so in Michigan, our Constitution was written in the 1960s, I think. We had a House of Representatives that was apportioned more or less based on population. The Senate was not. Our Constitution was basically struck down by the courts because you had an uneven number of people being represented in their state Senate districts. Okay. That was never struck down for the federal government because the Senate can't be unconstitutional because the Senate is written into the Constitution. Okay. And there's also this question is like, if the federal government can't do its constitutional job by reapportioning after the 1920 census across states, it's lost the moral high ground. But like, how do you tell a state to do what the federal government doesn't? Okay. I'm almost done. The Reapportionment Act of 1929, kind of the big picture was that Congress, I think more often than not, realizes it's not doing its job when it doesn't do its job. And in this case, it was not a good look for Congress not to adhere to the letter and spirit of the Constitution by reapportioning seats by population after the 1920 census. Key features of the debate around this time was, how do you count the disenfranchised if African Americans and immigrants are not being allowed to vote where they live? Should you count them towards the number of seats they get? And it's very reminiscent today of like how we count immigrants in many American cities who don't vote. Okay. So Congress's approach was in 1929, when they were debating this Reapportionment Act, they knew they had 3 or 4 years before they would have to make a decision before the next census. And it's politically easier, I think, to fix a broken rule before you know the winners and losers from the new rule than after the rule goes into effect. So they were operating under a gun time-wise. The other thing that they did is that they chose a rule that could theoretically last forever without having to reopen the debate. So, like, in an important part of the debate or at the time was, okay, if 435 is our number of members, we don't ever want to talk about this ever again. And we'll use the Capitol or office space on the Capitol as our excuse. Okay. And so the rules of the Reapportionment Act of 1929 is basically what we live with today. In the U.S. House today, there are still disparities in the population per seat. One of them is what I would call, most people who study this would call the Wyoming problem, where Wyoming has 1 House seat and 2 state Senate seats with fewer than 600,000 residents. Montana gets 2 House seats with about 540,000 residents each. Okay. And weigh that against Delaware. I think it has 2 seats, maybe 1, not important. Delaware has 990,000 people in its, oh, there it is. 990,000 people in its 1 district. And so like the disparities in representation are pretty significant because Wyoming and especially Montana get about twice as the number of representatives per person that Delaware does. Okay. And the average House district in the United States has about 760,000 residents. And again, to go back to the point I made at the start of the talk, like the founding fathers were concerned that if you had more than 30,000 members per district or 40,000 members per district, that was too many. Or no, they were concerned that having too many people per representative was a problem. And what do you think about, is 760,000 people in a being represented by one person too many or too few? Okay. Okay, where does Michigan stand in all this? Michigan has 13 seats with about 780,000 people living in each, at least after the last census. The high watermark for Michigan was 19 seats after the 1960 census. And we've lost a seat or two after almost every census since. And so in terms of the question that was posed earlier, why does Michigan keep losing seats? It's because Congress has decided 435 members of Congress is the maximum number of members of Congress. And Michigan, it just hasn't grown as fast as other states. Okay. And then there's in addition to our representation in Congress, the number of House seats we have also determines our representation in presidential elections. And there's a phrase that I would call electoral college equity. Okay. And this is based on the idea, to begin with, the number of votes a state gets for president in the electoral college is 2 for this number of Senate seats you have, plus the number of votes you have in the House, or seats you have in the House. Okay. I would say the electoral college is, quote, equitable if people get votes in the electoral college in proportion to the population of their state. Okay. And so if the number of House seats grew with population, the electoral college becomes more equitable because relatively speaking, the number of seats in the Senate is less than the number in the House. If the number of House seats fails to grow with population, the electoral college becomes less equitable because the Senate seats count proportionately more. Okay. And so since the state populations have grown and the House has not in more than 100 years, presidential elections have become less equitable. And I'm just going to skip back to my earlier slide. Like this graph is basically, you might think of it as it being a chart of how unequitable the electoral college is-ish. And it's gotten worse over time because as populations have grown, the importance of the Senate in representation and votes for president has gotten larger. And I think I'm roughly out of time and wanted to make sure I gave the audience time for questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was really intriguing. Jennifer has a question. So is there any chance that the apportionment will ever be addressed again? It doesn't seem likely in this climate. Do you see any reason where this would, or given that Congress sort of wanted to settle it in the 1929, do you think it's likely that they'll ever bring that back up?
I don't know. It keeps coming up. And there are people who work in think tanks and stuff like that. Is like the best thing that could possibly happen for the United States democracy is for us to reopen this question. And I think the underlying issue today is actually just the electoral college map, where the smaller states that are advantaged by the electoral college get a little bit extra. I'll call it, I don't want to make it a politically laden statement, but like red Republican states get a bigger boost from the electoral college than the larger blue states. And as long as the red states get that bump, I wouldn't expect it to be revisited. The more it's the more the better the parties are at competing equally in the small states and the large states, the more likely it is you are to see reform. And quite frankly, like, I think the argument that Congress just got too big for it's like a fishbowl and it's like a goldfish that got too big and can't grow anymore. It's a horrible argument to not build an extra office building or to subdivide an office or whatever. And I think practical people that would hope be open to that. I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers Jennifer's question, but
Yeah, she had kind of like a second follow-up. If hypothetically Canada is added as a 51st state, what would that do to the number of seats in the House?
so I have an empirical answer, which is in about 1960, we added Hawaii and Alaska to the United States. And we increased the number of seats by 2, so that way they got votes, and then we went right back to 435. And I can't imagine Canada only getting 1 seat, because I think Canada is California sized. And like in terms of like the ongoing political discussions, like I am not sure Republicans want to add what we would consider a reliably blue state to Congress that of the size of California in terms of votes.
Right. And that brings me to one of my questions. Are there people, like, is there someone like writing outside of like the discussions in 1920 saying like, oh, we don't want to give like Michigan more people because they have this great migration coming to them? Like, are people truly saying that out loud, or is that something that was like underwritten by the decision to not reapportion in 1920?
It was said out loud in 1920. Like the capacity of politicians to say things that offend me is not new. And they would have been pretty frank about the discussions about like what does it mean to let like African Americans or my family Polish Americans to actually participate and give them representation. They were pretty frank about it. And if you go back to the discussions in 1787, when they were talking about the 3/5 clause, like they were pretty frank about it. Not everyone, and it wasn't necessarily the people that you would have expected based on North versus South in the debates, but like frank conversations about race aren't new. And I think even today, when people talk about the census, like how do you count an immigrant? How do you count a citizen? What about an undocumented worker? In terms of like all the funding formulas that the federal government uses and the like who gets how many votes and how you draw maps, like
Yeah,
it's
so,
all there.
yeah, it's a very clear system. It seems like with clear sort of evidence of bias. What I guess following up on that question, how do immigrants get counted? I was under the impression that they counted as a whole person. Is that true? Or no?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's absolutely correct. But it's something people debate, and I think that to me the letter and spirit of the Constitution is crystal clear. Like if you're here, you get counted. And what was obviously less clear is um, not actually, not less clear, it was also crystal clear that not everyone's vote mattered the same. And the way I the other day I was telling my family I was doing this event and I was like, if you go back to the early 1800s, how many votes did I get? Because like when we think about voting for, it's maybe clearest with the Senate, like how many votes do you get versus someone from Wyoming? You probably only get a fraction of their votes. You go back to 1800, as a property white male, I kind of got the votes of myself, my wife, my children, my slaves if I own them, my servants. That's mathematically imperfect, but kind of that was the way the apportionment worked. I'm not sure where I'm going with that thought, but like you get the gist is like there's an underlying inequity in the who gets to cast a vote and how many people live there. Cheryl, you're muted, but go ahead.
Well, just clarify for me, based on what Ruth said and then what you said, are you saying that in your household back in the early days, when the Constitution was constituted, it would have everybody in your household would have been under your vote, and so it maximized, it could have been 10 people in your household and you got 10 votes yourself, or you 10 votes worth of power or something?
No, that's not
Okay,
that I understand how what I said was could be confusing in that regard. Like my point was maybe everyone in my congressional district, like in an imprecise way, you got more votes than your own because like so in elections to the Senate, how many votes do you get to cast?
2, don't we?
It depends. Most usually it would be just one, but
Oh, okay.
where every 4 years or whatever. Like,
Oh, true, true.
but yeah, that's the right spirit. Does someone in Wyoming get the same number of votes?
I would think.
Yeah. Who has more of an effect on the outcome of a Senate election in your state? You or the person living in Wyoming? And because Wyoming is so much smaller,
Mhm.
like your incremental effect on the election outcome there is a lot larger than it is here in Michigan. And so like the disparities in representation based on gender, income, race, etc., would have had a similar effect as size today.
I'm not sure I understand that, but if everybody does, then
Well, let's just say hypothetically, uh, like you have a traditional nuclear family, husband, wife, stop there. Only the husband gets to vote. How many votes does the husband cast in terms of influencing the representation in the House?
2 votes.
Two. And that's all I'm saying, right?
Oh,
But you can keep kind of, but when we count the census numbers, I think that was Ruth's point, who counts and who actually gets to vote. Once you start to count, like when I kind of do the math, it's not right, but I kind of get my vote in 1800. I got my wife's vote. I sort of got my kids' vote. I got to my slaves votes, my servants votes, like all these people who didn't actually have a vote, I could kind of, in the way that we did the apportionment for the House of Representatives, or actually lots of what we did, it concentrated the voting power in the, or multiplied the voting power of people who got to participate in ways I think more significant than we realize.
Hmm.
Because today when we think about equal rights for women and African Americans and so on, there's the equity question, like how dare we not let them vote? But there is also the power question, and I think I'm speaking to the power question, and it's not the power question of like I'm not letting you do this. It's actually I am exercising power in my own interest at the expense of maybe everybody else's.
Yeah.
It sounds
you.
to me a lot like all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others.
Yeah.
From Animal Farm.
No,
Um,
I have not read Animal Farm in a long time, but yes.
Sorry, I was just gonna ask about, I guess, the discussion of like how many people fit in the building. Like we could build new buildings, but I do see the argument a little bit that like the bigger it gets, the more unwieldy it gets, and the sort of unwieldiness that we
Yeah.
have now. Like, is there any precedent for in other countries or in other places, or in history? Obviously we're at a population scale that we haven't been at in history ever before, but like is there anything that could help sort of like, would it actually be easier because there's so many of them, it's harder for one person to have a crazy loud voice in such a large room? Or what are your thoughts on the sort of unwieldiness of like, if we, I haven't done the math, but if we had 1,000-person Congress, would that work in your opinion? I know that's a hard one, but
Actually, I don't have any country that I would say, oh, they've got 8,000 members of their parliament. We should replicate them. But what tends to happen is when you have so many people, power gets concentrated into the hands of just a few. And it's that kind of channeling of power in order to get stuff done, where that balancing act, I think, becomes more complicated. Because like I can totally understand the more people makes it harder argument. I tend to agree with that, but politicians are very good at devising rules in order to solve problems like that. Um, um, and in certain respects, I think we're seeing it kind of played out in the House of Representatives over the last couple of days about the budget stuff, where like to a certain extent, responsibility is channeled into the hands of just a few decision makers, and the tight margins between Democrats and Republicans in the House in particular make it hard. But like it's that channeling of power and authority and responsibility into the hands of a few people that is how the body works. And so like in a parliamentary system, I think it's a lot easier to say, oh, this is our prime minister, power all goes through him or her. And then they have to work out arrangements in their cabinet, and then everyone is expected to fall in line behind them. Like that's not, I don't think in most places written into their constitution, that's just how it works. And in the US Congress, they can come up with a new set of rules in order to channel decision-making authority into a small number of people, like the way our Congress works is a lot of that responsibility goes through the Speaker of the House today. And basically nothing gets voted on in Congress without the Speaker's consent. Including amendments to like bills and stuff like that. But that's just but Congress gets to make Congress votes by majority rule what its rules are, and it's chosen the rule that channels power in that way. And that's a very long answer to your question, I think.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I have one more question. Back when they're trying to figure out taxation and representation and how those maybe are tied or not tied, why did they never, you know, if the Constitution is written to tie them together, why did they not actually in the end do that? And why did they not then go back and resolve the discrepancy between those two thoughts? Like how to apportion taxes, how to apportion representatives.
Because there were rich states and poor states. And so at the time, North Carolina was like a famously poor state. And if you wanted to have a large federal government like Alexander Hamilton wanted to do, you couldn't, North Carolina couldn't afford it. And so in order to kind of break that, sever the like relationship between population and taxes, that's why we had the tariff system for most of American history, because the tariffs aren't levied on Americans exactly. They're levied on, and like it all ties to all the debates we're having right now in ways that we haven't talked about in years. But it's actually levied on imports, and we end up paying more one way or the other. But it's not based on how many butts and chairs we have in a given state. It's based on how much we spend on whatever is being brought into the country. Cheryl?
A question. Besides feeling today, like, boy, do I not know a lot of these things, and I should attend one of your classes if ever feasible. But at any rate, I was a little confused at the beginning. You did not indicate, did you, that the states themselves were taxed? I mean, like they said, Michigan has to pay this much of taxes, or was it just assumed that taxes were going to flow into the federal government? Obviously, they set that up in the system as well as state. I mean, and that somehow the federal would get some of the state, or were they always kind of separate?
Yeah, so
I
when they
mean-
were having these discussions, they didn't really know how the tax system was going to work. They're just, but the way it worked under the Articles of Confederation, which was our Constitution during the American Revolution and a little while after, was that each state was said, this is how much you owe.
Oh.
And then the states didn't pay.
Of course.
And so like part of what Alexander Hamilton did when he designed his plan for public finance early in the country's history was he said, I don't think the states are going to pay, so I'm going to come up with a system that I can make them pay. And the easy way to do it is on imports, because you can have a couple of people collecting tariffs at ports, and that's easy to do ish. That people can cheat as long as you don't, but they might not even bother if you don't charge them too much. The other thing he did, because he did have an expansive view of federal authorities, he taxed whiskey and stuff like that. And the thing about those taxes is like, I don't think they actually ever generated a huge amount of revenue, but what it allowed them to do is put a federal presence in what I would call the hinterland at the time, what was the frontier. And you would have a federal tax collector and some kind of court system saying, we're in charge here, even if you don't think so. But I think that part of it was less about money than it was about power,
Control.
the exercise of power.
Hmm.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. We never did it that way, or like we tried it and it failed abominably. Uh, um, and so that's how we ended up with the system we did for so long. But
Thank you.
I don't want to monopolize, if anyone else has questions, you can either put them in the
Yes,
chat, or maybe we could.
We can open it up.
Yeah.
So if you would like to contribute, I'm going to allow people to unmute. If this will pay attention.
And I guess I wonder if, and maybe you don't have, this is a little off topic. Do you know when they started collecting federal taxes from individuals?
they started collecting. I don't claim a great deal of expertise in public finance. But I think they started collecting the first income taxes or during the Civil War. And the court said that's not okay. So they passed the constitutional amendment in 1900-ish to make it constitutional to have income taxes in the way that you and I are familiar with today.
And I don't think they actually had a tax imposed until World War I, right? That's based on reading, but not recent.
If they did, it was small.
Mhm.
And I don't think they would have gone through the political cost of saying this is our new tax system if they didn't intend to exercise it, but I think it was small.
Well, I did want to say that everyone else who's in this meeting is allowed to unmute themselves now, if they want to take part.
And then I guess one other, well, if folks are thinking or finding the right buttons, one other quick sort of thought or question reflecting on your quote of the like no taxation without representation. A lot of immigrants pay a lot of taxes, but don't get to vote. Is there like are there discussions around that? Are there like it seems unlikely that we will give them the vote anytime soon, like because they're foreign nationals or whatever. I don't know, but I wonder if there's anyone making an argument that they should because they are paying taxes.
I have
That's
not heard
founding.
anyone making that argument today.
Yeah.
If you go back to 1776 or whatever, I think basically the way our voting rights worked is like you could show up and say, how dare you not let me vote when you, and they're like, okay. Just because like the cost of like, imagine getting on your horse and driving whatever, riding halfway across your county to cast a vote, and then be told, oh, you don't have your whatever form of paperwork, or I guess like if it was property restrictions, like the county sheriff was just at by your farm and he had out his yardstick, and he says you have 49.5 acres, not 50. And the early election rules basically said if you lived in your community for some number of times and you were of good character, you get to vote.
I remember that from in certain states, especially property holders, obviously.
Yeah. And over time, relatively early in American history, parties that were losing votes to immigrant groups said, we're going to start making it harder and harder to be a citizen and to vote. And so like some of what we discussed today in politics about immigration and suffrage and stuff like that, like was the expression, everything old is new again. But like with suffrage, you can go back to like the start of our country and see important aspects of it.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I found it really interesting. We didn't have all that many people, but I think the people here were interested. Cheryl?
I just wondered if will you send us your slides? I would love to do my own refresher course on this because they're very good slides. Are you able to do that or not?
I'll send it to Ruth or
Yeah, or
Jennifer, and
Jennifer.
they can just forward them to whomever.
Yeah,
Like, there's nothing
yes,
secret
thank
here.
you. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
I thought it was extremely interesting too. I didn't realize how much I didn't even know or cared about all of this. And my goodness, this is well worth understanding as part of our whole government and how it functions or doesn't function.
Well, perhaps more people will listen or will watch the recording. And that recording will be on the library's YouTube channel. We have a special sub-channel just the league programs, and I put it in the chat. You can always email me, jdye@detroitpubliclibrary.org if you want any of this information. And shortly after it's on our YouTube channel, it will go to the league. And again, we are certainly trying to let people weigh in. We'd like to be able to email people, remind them something is coming up.
And what is the next one coming up in April?
Yes, the next one is April 8th. It's called Anatomy of a Lame Duck. And it is about lame duck legislature in Michigan from last year, obviously going over into this year.
And then we have another one, May. Did you want to mention May's?
Yes, let me see. Here we go. I thought I was pasting in the Eventbrite. There, I have
sorry.
to. No, I just thought I was doing that and I didn't. Our May one is designing and conducting a petition drive in Michigan, because there have been so many petition drives that have failed in the last few years because of minutia. And I'm seeing notes and not my my chat. Let's see, I don't have chat anymore. Ruth and Cheryl, I sent both of you the link. It is in Eventbrite. If you register for any of our programs and choose to follow Knapp branch, you will also get all of the children's programs, but those are entertaining. But you will get the programs that I run, the League of Women Voters and the astronomy programs when I get them started again.
Yeah, and they're excellent astronomy programs as well as I think ours are, but
Well, thank you so much. This is something that's been bothering me for a while, but not enough to actually go look it up. So I really appreciate it, Jeff.
You're very welcome. It's nice meeting everybody.
Mhm.
Great meeting you.
Yes.